topic is, as Adam's already framed it, sentientism, which I describe or summarize, as you can see on this opening page, as evidence, reason, and compassion, critically for all sentient beings. But it might be useful to explain what sentientism is, and I describe it really as a worldview, a way of looking at the world and understanding it. And the reason I think worldviews are important is because whether we know it or not, every human being has a worldview. We have a way of thinking about the world around us. Some like to make them quite explicit, others it's a more implicit thing. But it strikes me that when we look around the world today, that all of the human-caused problems we see are either at their root, either because of some sort of failure of compassion. You know, we've failed to care, or failed to extend our moral consideration in some direction, maybe to other humans, maybe to animals, maybe to the environment. So we've just decided we don't care for some reason. Or it's a failure of belief in some sense. We've just got things wrong about the world around us. We might believe in things that are fabricated, or we've just made a mistake, or we've misunderstood evidence. And I'd be interested if people can think of counterexamples, but as I've worked through many human-caused problems, they all seem to come down to those two problems: a failure of compassion, or a failure of epistemology, if you like. How do we know the world? And because us humans, whether we like it or not, have enormous power for good and ill across the world, it seems to me really important, the worldviews that us humans hold, because we have so much power. And to me, the most important things for a worldview to get right are to answer the deepest philosophical questions. One is, I guess, what's real, and how should we know things accurately about the world? The other is, who gets to care, right? Who matters, and who matters morally? So again, in philosophical terms, that's epistemology, you know, how do we know things? And ethics, you know, what do we care about, and who gets to matter? And that's really the framing for this idea of sentientism. It's supposed to be a very, very basic, very broad, very simple worldview that answers those two questions. How should we go about knowing, and who and what should matter? So to run you through that evidence, reason, and compassion structure, the first 2 points, evidence and reason, are answering that first question: how should we go about knowing, and what should we know? And it suggests that we should use a combination of evidence. This can be all sorts of different evidence from our own personal experiences, our own senses, from science, from listening to each other, you know, all sorts of different evidence. But we should try and gather that evidence honestly from reality and use that as a basis for our understanding of reality. And then we combine that with a process of reasoning. And there's lots of different ways of doing reasoning. We know our reasoning is always flawed. We're never going to be perfect, but at least we try and have a intellectually honest approach to thinking about the stuff we find out. So it suggests that sort of naturalistic evidence and reason answer to the question of what's real and how should we go about knowing things. That second important question, who gets to count and ethics, is answered, and the clue is in the name, by the suggestion we should have moral consideration for sentient beings. The word sentientism is a little tricky to say, but if you break it up into sentient and just put ism on the end, it becomes a little bit more fluid. And that word sentient is the essence of, I guess, the scope of compassion sentientism suggests. And sentience, in its simplest definition, is really just the capacity to have experiences, or as examples, to have the capacity to experience suffering or flourishing, which might be terms you could use for any sort of bad experience or any good experience. So sentientism suggests we should have compassion for all sentient beings, any being that can suffer or flourish, in simple terms. And that's basically it. So I've suggested on the right-hand side a way you might come into that way of thinking. And it starts out with the sense that each of us have, I hope, that we feel sentient. You know, we're experiencing this conversation right now. Hopefully you're not suffering too much and you're flourishing at least a little bit in the conversation. But, you know, we are having experiences. They can be positive, they can be negative, they can be neutral. You know, that's one of the things that we're most confident of, is that we're experiencing. And as we look around ourselves, we can reason based on the evidence from reality that many other beings seem to be sentient too. I can look at the people on this call. You know, I have a very high credence that you're probably sentient. And because I experience suffering as bad and flourishing as good, again, this seems really obvious and pretty basic. I want to live and I want to flourish, and I don't want to suffer and I don't want to die. This is pretty straightforward stuff. But again, it seems logically straightforward that, you all and other sentient beings probably feel in a similar way. Suffering almost tautologically, almost definitionally, is a bad thing. And if our morality is about, in any sense, having a concern for others, if our morality is about some sense of caring for others outside of ourselves, there's an implication for me that we need to be thinking about the perspective of those others when we're thinking about what right and wrong and good and bad are. And if you're thinking about the perspective of another, I guess you are talking about their own experiences and how they feel about those experiences. And morality, almost definitionally, in this way of thinking, is caring about the experiences of others. And if we're caring about the experiences of others, to my mind, it makes sense to care about all others who can have experiences. I can't see why there would be a reason we would care about some of the beings that have experiences, but not others. So, wouldn't it be consistent for us to have moral consideration for every being that can suffer or can flourish? So again, that's a sort of example personal journey that some people might go through to arrive at a sort of sentientist way of thinking. I'm happy to sort of take questions as I go through as well, but hopefully that lays it out fairly clearly. It might be useful to summarize very quickly on this page, I guess, its intellectual heritage and where these ideas of sentientism came from. And I'd summarize it really as two main threads. The central one that you can see is this naturalistic idea of using evidence and reason to try and understand the world, maybe set in contrast to sort of revelation or a fideism or maybe a supernatural worldview. So that naturalistic way of thinking has got very deep ancient roots all around the world in many cultures. That naturalistic way of thinking, to some degree, predates many of the modern religions, many modern schools of thought. It certainly predates the modern Enlightenment, goes back deep into human past. And you could, if you want to get really edgy, say, well, in a sense, it's even pre-human, because there's a degree to which even non-human animals that existed long before humanity came on the scene were using evidence from their senses of their environment to try and honestly develop beliefs and understandings and operate on that basis. So it may be pushing it a little bit too far to say non-human and pre-human animals were naturalistic before we came on the scene, but I quite like extending that intellectual heritage even pre-human if you want to go that far. The other critical chunk, which is more about the ethics on the left-hand side, is this concept that it's not just humans that matter morally, maybe non-human animals matter. And again, this is a line of thought that, of course, has lots of modern themes around veganism and animal ethics and animal rights that you can trace back through some of the names I've laid out there, through the 21st century, the 20th century. You can push that back into the 18th century to people like Jeremy Bentham, who asked that central question. The question is not, can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer, which is another great way of thinking about sentience. But again, you can go much, much deeper than that. So when you go into, again, around the world, ancient cultures, religious and not, you'll find concepts like ahimsa, the idea of doing no harm, which from its very earliest roots wasn't just about doing no harm to humans. It was about doing no harm to any being that can be harmed, which is, again, another way of saying sentient. So both the naturalism idea, how do we understand reality, and this idea of an ethic that goes out to include all sentient beings have deep and ancient roots. And I guess what I'm suggesting here is that they come together in this idea of sentientism. I won't talk about the stuff on the right-hand side, but we can get into that in the Q&A if you like, because there's some slightly weird sci-fi stuff going on if people are interested in futurism and sci-fi ideas, but let's leave that for the Q&A. Again, I won't take you through all of these different dimensions, but it's interesting to, one of my hesitations about talking about sentientism is we already have too many isms. There are many of them. But I thought there was something distinctive about this idea that led me to sort of take the word that's been around since the 1970s and try and refresh it and modernize it and build a movement around it. But for the purposes of this conversation, it might be worth drawing at least maybe 3 of these examples out. So one is, some of you may be familiar with the movement and the idea of humanism, which in a sense sounds quite similar. It has a sort of evidence and reason naturalistic way of understanding the world, but you can tell the difference already in the name is that humanism, the center of gravity of it, is still about the human species. That's a little unfair because many humanists have a much broader range of compassion, but the movement itself, the center of gravity is still about humans. So sentientism clearly contrasts there in explicitly setting a moral scope based on sentience, not just on, I guess, a human species solidarity. To the bottom right, veganism, of course, a vibrant and rapidly growing movement, which has a lot in common with sentientism, because I think many vegans, certainly ethical vegans, their motivation really is driven by that concern for sentience, for wanting to try and avoid causing suffering or death, particularly where it's needless. So there's a strong overlap there, I guess, in terms of the way of thinking. But there are some differences. Sentientism is explicitly naturalistic, whereas many ethical vegans aren't. And there's also some wiggle room around the edges. And most definitions of veganism focus on the word animal, which is more of a taxonomic definition, whereas sentientism focuses on the characteristic of sentience. So what that does, in a sense, is focus on a characteristic rather than a group of beings. They overlap pretty strongly because current scientific evidence demonstrates that many animals we might think of are sentient, so there's an overlap there. But at the borders, there are some slight differences, with some of the very simplest animals. For example, like a sea sponge, it has no nervous system at all. So, you might argue that's an animal, but not a sentient being. So there are some slight differences, but there's overlap too. But the third difference and contrast I wanted to draw was on the top left with eco and biocentrism, which I think will be relevant to the work that Terra and these groups do, that I'll come on to in more detail now, because you might set sentientism on a spectrum, if you like, of thinking about who gets to count, this ethical question. And it might make sense for me to delve into a little bit more detail on the next page about that spectrum, because you can think of a spectrum going from anthropocentrism, which is focusing on humans and centering on humans, broadening out to sentiocentrism, which is focusing on sentience, broadening out even more to biocentrism, which is a moral consideration, if you like, for all living things, including those that aren't sentient, and going out even beyond that to something like ecocentrism or holism, which might care even about non-living entities in our environment as well. So they're almost, you can think of them as concentric circles going broader and broader. But what I thought might be useful to do on this page, and again, it's a bit detailed, but I'm very happy to send the slides around if people want to delve into it, is to zero in on who matters in these different ways of thinking, because I think that's one of the centrally important things for us to get right if we're trying to do good in the world, is who gets included, who gets to count, and who gets excluded. Because in simple terms, if you're excluded from moral consideration, you are rendered meaningless and valueless, and that means basically anything can be done to you with complete impunity. So to even have some basic chance of benefiting or from compassion or from care, you need to be included in our worldview. So what I've tried to do here is set out on the left-hand side a bunch of types of entities, things, if you like. And I've included a load of animals, human, charismatic wild animals, companion animals, farmed animals, other wild animals, non-sentient animals like the sea sponge I mentioned. I've included plants as the primary example of living entities that current science doesn't think are sentient. I've included environmental non-living stuff there as well. So rocks, rivers, mountains, species, diversity, concepts like that. And again, with the sci-fi hat on, artificial and alien intelligence at the bottom. So if you like, you've got a menu of entities and you can work out who gets to count. Then I've put in a, is it sentient question, which again, sentientism doesn't tell us the right answer. It just says take a naturalistic sort of scientific approach, be prudent and try and follow the evidence. But I think I've done a reasonable job of suggesting where current scientific consensus is that humans, many wild animals, companion animals, farmed animals, most other wild animals are sentient, and the other stuff isn't. And then let's run through, and you can see how all of these different worldviews that I've set out across the top might grant moral consideration, who gets to count, who gets a tick or a question mark or a cross. So I'd suggest the default human, and it's a bit hard to summarize given the diversity of our own species, will grant moral consideration to humans. Now, some, and there are many problems with intrahuman ethics that we're still working through, will only grant moral consideration to subgroups, and we know what horrors that can lead to. But at least in concept, I think most humans recognize the validity of, for example, universal human rights. Every human, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, where they grew up, class, background, should get to matter. So they get a reasonably solid tick. Charismatic wild animals, I think people will feel that they matter, but it's a little bit of a question mark. It sort of depends which you are and in what context. People enjoy watching them on nature programs, but it's not clear whether they really have moral consideration for those charismatic wild animals. Companion animals, again, you generally get a pretty solid tick. Many of you will share your homes with a rabbit or a guinea pig or a cat or a dog or some form of companion. And I think they, by and large, do get moral consideration. We can think about scientific ways of assessing sentience, but you also just need to look into the eyes of a puppy and you'll get a pretty direct, intuitive answer that there is a being there can suffer and flourish too. So I think they get a pretty strong tick too, although the way some companion animals are treated leads me to put a bit of a question mark in. Then we get to a difficult point with the default human, because while we intuitively feel that compassion for a companion puppy at our feet, farmed animals in practical terms do not get moral consideration. Again, there might be a conceptual moral consideration there in extremis, but in the way most humans practically take decision in their lives, farmed animals don't get moral consideration. And I'd argue other wild animals don't either. If you're charismatic and you're on a nature program, you've got a bit of a chance, but given there are probably a quintillion or a sextillion of other wild animals out there, there's essentially zero moral consideration granted to them as well. So let's move across now into different ways of thinking. I'm going to skip the default humanist version and come to the sentientist view and show basically how that, I think, distinguishes itself from a default human starting point. Humans get a solid tick because humans are sentient, so they're in. Charismatic wild animals get a solid tick because, to the degree they're sentient, they're in. And again, it's mind-blowing to consider this category and the other wild category. The scale is absolutely mind-blowing. It's almost impossible to quantify, but the estimates are something like a sextillion sentient beings out there in the wild. I think it's a 1 with 21 zeros after it. So the scale is pretty mind-blowing. But if they're sentient, they get a tick. Companion animals, of course, they're sentient, they get a tick. Farmed animals, again, the animals we farm are by and large sentient, they get a tick, which leads you to the overlap with veganism I mentioned earlier on. And other wild animals, again, get a tick. So that's quite clear. Now, a strict sentientist gives a cross to plants and the environment and some of these other concepts, but a strict sentientist like myself would still richly care about plants, the environment, species, habitats, rocks, rivers, the ecosystems, the earth as Gaia, but we do that instrumentally because those things are so important to the experiences of all the sentient beings that live on this planet and share and need that environment, which may seem a bit silly, but it's slightly different from intrinsically granting moral consideration. And the reason for that is quite simple, in that if we come back to the way I described that whole imperative to consider the perspective of the other, I guess the sentientist would say, a farmed animal or a wild animal that's sentient does have its own perspective. It can suffer, it can flourish, it can have interests and preferences and want its life to be a certain way. And our morality is concerned for that. Whereas they'd argue a rock or a river or a tree might be deeply important in instrumental ways because of the sentient beings that live on and around them, including humans, but they don't have their own perspective. They can't in themselves suffer or flourish. So in themselves, we don't need to give them compassion, but we can care about them in other ways, if that makes sense. So a couple of other examples as we go further towards the right. And I mentioned already this idea of biocentrism, caring about all living things, and ecocentrism, caring about, even more broadly than that, non-living elements of our environments too. Slightly cheekily, I've described a sort of consistent biocentrist or an ecocentrist, because what I suggest a biocentrist or an ecocentrist should do is tick all the same boxes as the sentients, because, for example, farmed animals are living beings, so they should count if you're a biocentrist, right? They should get direct moral consideration. They're also parts of our ecosystem, so they should count too. So a consistent biocentrist or a consistent ecocentrist should tick all the same boxes as the sentientist, but also add ticks for plants, non-sentient living things, and then by extension, species, mountains, rocks, rivers, ecosystems as well. Unfortunately, what I more often see is people who've taken a biocentrist or a ecocentrist stance in one sense. They say, look, I care about plants, rocks, rivers, trees, and ecosystems, but they're in a way dragged back to the human default when it comes back to thinking about other wild animals and particularly farmed animals. So unfortunately, the sort of default biocentrist or the default ecocentrist, while it seems quite generous in terms of expanding this scope of moral consideration really broadly out to non-living elements of the environment and non-sentient living things, sometimes unfortunately puts crosses in the boxes practically when it comes to farmed and other wild sentient animals. So hopefully that's given you, it's probably too much, but it's given you a sense of the practical implications of what our worldview might do for who gets to count in our moral system. And you can imagine the implications that might have for our own personal decisions, but also for policy, for institutional interventions, and so on. So there's another half of this presentation which I'm not going to go into, so don't worry when you look at the slide numbers. I want to stop on this page and then we can go into a conversation. But I wanted to draw out some implications of this way of thinking that hopefully will be relevant to the environmental and the climate imperatives that Terra and your teams are learning about and working on. So on the left-hand side, this naturalistic approach of evidence and reason, to my mind, suggests that we should think about reality in a way that is grounded in humility and doubt. And that rather than forming 100% binary beliefs about things that are true or not true, which humans love to do, we love binaries, we should instead think about credences. So they're like beliefs, but they're just more probabilistic. So the idea would be, rather than saying I'm 100% sure that, for example, Adam is sentient, I might have a very high degree of credence, a certain percentage probability that he is, based on the evidence that I've received so far from talking to him on Twitter and here. So our credences should be probabilistic, rather than 100% locked in one way or the other. Secondly, that they should be provisional, because part of the idea behind that probability is you'll shift it as new evidence comes in. If you learn something new, you find out something differently. Your credences will shift and those probabilities will go up and down. So that's what I mean by provisional. And that's really where the humility comes from. There's always a chance we might be wrong. And that the third P, after probabilistic and provisional, is that we should be prudent where our decisions are going to have some sort of ethical impact on others. We should be careful, benefit of the doubt, move cautiously, and so on and so forth. So that's, I guess, one line of thinking that comes through this naturalistic way of thinking that I think is really important in how we work on environmental and climate issues too. And that's partly because if we're really trying to do that well and reason honestly, we've got to be very aware of our own limitations as evolved human apes when we're trying to think about evidence and reasoning, because our evidence is never going to be perfect. Our perceptions are always subject to illusions. Our science is a human enterprise that makes mistakes and has flaws. Our own reasoning has biases, motivated reasoning. There's all sorts of different problems in our own reasoning that we need to be skeptical of and ready to address. And that can be really important in issues like climate change and the environment, because the ethical imperative seems so strong for us. That sometimes that can lead us into motivated reasoning, maybe overstating cases or looking for certain types of evidence that support our conclusions. So I think there's some important lessons there about maintaining our own credibility through that humility and learning about and understanding. And the final point is really important, which I think helps us avoid those binaries and that overconfidence and maintain that humility. It's just to be comfortable saying, I don't know. Reality is super complex. So are our own minds. It's okay to say, I don't know, and keep trying to work out a better answer than it is to switch to a binary or follow some sort of polarized group-driven dynamic down a particular path. Saying I don't know is an intellectually healthy thing to do. On the right-hand side, there's a few implications there as well. So I do think this focus on sentience does draw us to remind ourselves about the individuals. So I think groups and concepts can be deeply important. So in this context, thinking about ecosystems, thinking about habitats, thinking about species, thinking about biodiversity are all richly important. But I would argue that ultimately, those are concepts that can't suffer in their own right. They are important because they're useful ways of describing large-scale complex impacts that ultimately impact the individuals. So I do, in my way of thinking about this, pull everything back to the suffering and the flourishing of individuals. So I think that's an interesting lens to remind ourselves of. Sometimes we can get lost thinking about abstract concepts and groups and large macro concepts, and it's also always useful to draw us back to the individual. There's a central question there about, is an individual sentient or not? And again, I'm suggesting we should take a sort of naturalistic, scientific, prudent approach to trying to work that out, where we grant beings the benefit of the doubt. That might be something that comes up in question. And this look through their eyes thing, I think it's absolutely central to morality. We're really used to doing this in human ethics. Right? One of the most essential things we do in human ethics is consider the perspective of the other, particularly if there's a victim of oppression, a victim of something bad that's being done. We will immediately, intuitively think, what would it feel like to be one of those people? And I guess all sentientism is suggesting is that's exactly the mindset we should try and adopt when we're thinking about other sentient beings too. It may feel a little bit harder with a non-human sentient being because they are of a different species. But I think for the most important needs and interests and wishes that we have as humans, those are the ones that are most richly shared across the rest of certainly the animal kingdom too. So while we might not know, exactly what it's like to be a bat, and a pig in a farm might not have exactly the same richness of career aspirations as someone on this call might have, when you get down to the real basics, the really fundamentally important stuff, even for us as humans, wanting to live, wanting to avoid suffering, wanting to avoid physical pain, wanting emotional reassurance, wanting a social network and a family, the most important things, sustenance, shelter, I think we can be pretty confident we can at least get a rough idea of what it might be like to be a non-human sentient too. And the final, two more things. One is, again, I think it's really important in the environmental and the climate space generally to make sure that our concern for nature and ecosystems doesn't turn into an unquestioning reverence. And there's a fallacy called the naturalistic fallacy, which can lead people to assume that because something is in nature, i.e., without human intervention or involvement, it is by definition a good thing. And I can understand that perspective because of the damage that humans often cause and the hubris we often have about the way we intervene. But we need to be a little bit careful that reverence doesn't hide a great deal of suffering. And I think we should just take a more balanced approach to thinking about nature and what it is. To my mind, nature is, it's not good, it's not bad, it's amoral. I think it's just a process and it has an enormous amount of wonder in it. It has a lot of aesthetic pleasure for us. It has a lot of flourishing sentient beings in it, but it also has a lot of suffering sentient beings in it as well. So I think we just need to watch for, that's one trap I sometimes see come through in environmental movements, is this a reverence for nature that leads us to ignore the interests of many of the sentient beings that might be out there in nature. And I'll finish on a really positive, hopeful point, which is I think there are so many difficult, complex problems in the world where interests conflict, where reality is deeply hard to understand, where we just don't know the way forward. But the more I think about issues, particularly in the climate environment spaces, it seems that there are some very glaringly obvious win-win-wins that can be very good for humans, can be very good for non-human sentience, and can be very good for the environment that we all share and live in too. And I think if we can zero in on those win-wins, one, I think their impact will be enormous, but two, politically, we're much more likely to be able to get traction because we don't have to fight quite so many fights. We can get lots of diverse groups with different perspectives, with different value systems to come together and to drive things forward that will help on the human and non-human sentient and an environmental lens too. So let me stop there. And yeah, I'd love to go into a conversation about what you think of the idea and whether you think it's useful or not.